Religion and philosophy are often set into a kind of dichotomy these days. Religion is said to be backed by faith and dogma, philosophy led by doubt and reason. But this dichotomy has much, much more to do with historical accident than either the nature of philosophy or religion. Indeed, this seemingly parting of the ways between the two is a uniquely modern phenomenon. Now, that's not to say there's not something actually substantive in this dichotomy, but to appreciate what is living and what is dead in the contemporary divergence between philosophy and religion, it's worth understanding the history of this split within the inner logic and development of both philosophy and religion, specifically by exploring the means by which philosophy and religion claim to come at or to arrive at metaphysical truth itself. And for the specific genre of this channel, Esoterica, claims about the nature of metaphysical truths arrived at via mystical experience or something like gnosis, truths that both religious devotees and philosophers have both expressed. Now, to explore these tensions and the origins of the divergence in philosophy and religions, especially around truth claims underwritten by mystical experiences, I want to turn to the most powerful philosopher of modernity, the critical philosophy of Immanuel Kant and his famed Copernican hypothesis, whereby the mind necessarily imposes conditions upon reality in order for any experience of reality to be possible at all. Indeed, the critical philosophy is often taken to be the high watermark of modern philosophy as such, but if we only experience these representations of reality as structured by our mind, doesn't that bar the door to any knowledge of, the things in themselves, those pesky things in themselves, and thus close the door to the possibility of knowledge received through direct mystical experience, or gnosis? Does the critical philosophy foreclose upon the possibility of all mystical knowledge, and even speculative metaphysics as such? That's certainly the textbook story you get in an academic classroom, and that's not going to fly around here. But let's explore how Kant's critical philosophy, including the Copernican hypothesis, were born in the exploration of the mystical visions of yet another famous Emmanuel of that period, Emmanuel Swedenborg, and just what the limits the critical philosophy actually imposes upon mystical truth and gnosis. Make sure to subscribe here to Esoterica for weekly explorations of topics in esoteric history. And if you'd like to support this work of providing evidence-backed, free, and accessible content like this, I'd hope you consider checking out my Patreon and some of the cool merch we have on the channel. And if you're just new to the study of esotericism, you should make sure to check out my study guide, which will orient you to the lay of the land for the literature of this kind of material. And if you're interested in actual historical books of magic and the occult, check out my bookstore over at Esoterica Rare Books. You can find all of that information in the description and in the pinned comment below. But now, let's actually turn to the occult origins of the critical philosophy and the confines which might bind mysticism within the boundaries of reason alone. I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. If you study the history of philosophy, and I don't mean the history of philosophy as it gets taught in most academic settings, I mean the actual history of philosophy, you'll notice that so-called religious and mystical and even esoteric seekers after the truth are right there alongside folks deploying pure reason, empirical testing, and pure analysis through logic in their joint quest for absolute and fundamental truths. In fact, they're not just alongside one another, they're just the same people often. From the mystical dreams of Parmenides to Descartes, the Western search for truth has always been guided by the gods as much as by human reason. Indeed, so-called occult philosophers, or at least philosophers informed by occult revelations, were often at the absolute forefront of philosophical, scientific, religious, and spiritual development itself. Indeed, these occult philosophers just comprise the lion's share of much of what we call Middle and Neoplatonism, along with basically all of Renaissance philosophy. And students of philosophy outside of basically Italy will also notice that the odds are that they likely received little to no training in these periods or those figures. I mean, I got a PhD in philosophy and spent 5 years of my education, and not a single seminar on any of this material or any of these people was even ever offered. Indeed, it was slurred as simply not being philosophy at all. And so why is that? It's because Western academic philosophy has adopted a dogmatic myth that philosophy is about the use of reason alone, specifically deductive logic alone, in the search for truth, and thus philosophy that doesn't adhere to this dogma is cast out as basically a bunch of nonsense thrown out of the canon, a process well on its way and well on display in Johann Jakob Brücker's 18th century History of Philosophy, which first marginalizes and ultimately omits anything that he considers to be Pythagorean Platonic Kabbalah, just pagan superstition as far as he's concerned. And in some sense, the way we teach and learn the history of philosophy is just downstream of Brücker, a fact basically unknown to most students and even most teachers of philosophy. But this shift wasn't just the result of a single history of philosophy textbook being published by some guy in the 18th century. The industrial and technocratic social shifts also saw the rise of both mechanistic rational and radically empirical philosophies through the 17th and 18th centuries. Indeed, the occult philosophy was absolutely buffeted on all sides through the 17th century. The Corpus Hermeticum was shown to be a Roman-era composition, not the work of some ancient antediluvian primordial wisdom. Natural philosophy was increasingly displaying the fact that transmutation was impossible, and that a cosmos in which astrology or a great chain of being made increasingly little sense for the discoveries in post-Galilean cosmology. Rationalism was developing analysis like the Port Royal logic, which greatly tested the logic of theology and mysticism, and the violent wars between Catholics and Protestants left little room for the tiny group of occult philosophers, which were basically a tiny little elite minority, basically disliked by both sides. However, continental rationalism and insular empiricism were increasingly reaching in non-commiserate directions. Doubtful empiricism was producing, frankly, amazing experimental results, but seemed to bar the door to the very metaphysical foundations that it would require to make sense of itself. Rationalism generated metaphysical speculation with logical and even mathematical precision, but they often remain locked within the confines of the human minds, with its gods and souls and monads and all of those entities. And of course, this is the part of the story where Immanuel Kant swoops in and saves philosophy by synthesizing both empiricism and rationalism, by revealing that all knowledge does in fact begin in experience, but must also be conformed to the mind by reason. This is the ingenious critical philosophy that began to be expounded sometime around the 1781 Critique of Pure Reason, though a bit before that as well. At any rate, but it was extended to the analysis of ethics in the 1788 Critique of Practical Reason, and then to aesthetics in the 1790 Critique of Judgment. At the core of Kant's philosophy is a dual mechanism of experience, whereby one, reason receives from the world sensible intuitions, whereby empirical cognitions are limited by the mind to those which can occur in space and time, and two, how the mind spontaneously imposes upon the world categorical organization, things like cause and effect, whereby the world can be conceived to us or by us as intelligible in the first place. For Kant, for us to obtain determinate empirical cognitions of the kind that constitute a science, or really any justified true belief about the world, is only possible insofar as entities can appear to us in space and time, be the objects of sensation through experience, and be conformed to and by our minds through the organization of the mental categories. Thus, our minds operate as something like filters which process experience to be intelligible to us at all. Or they're kind of like glasses that make the world visible to us, something like that. Now, the upshot of this philosophy is that it seemingly does reconcile both empiricism and rationalism. So that's good. We're neither the passive recipients of mere sensations, but nor are we locked within the unchecked solipsistic realm of pure reason alone. But for the would-be mystic, there should already be something immediately alarming about the critical philosophy. Famously for Kant, because of this mental filtration, we only ever experience representations of reality, never reality in itself. Further, because we must have sensation-based experience to start the process of forming those representations, certain classic metaphysical questions will forever remain unanswerable to us, especially whether or not God actually exists, whether or not human beings actually have free will, and whether or not the human soul is immortal. These are big questions, and Kant says they're never going to be answerable. This is why it's a critique of pure reason. A reason, or the mind alone, simply can't answer such questions, and when it attempts to do so, it will always produce results that are as spurious as they are speculative, dogmatic, as Kant has it. But what about the noetic data or content had from mystical experiences? On the traditional reading of Kant, those two are rejected as not only metaphysically dogmatic, but worse, schwärmerei. They're declared as something like fanatical, ecstatic, delusional. In fact, Palmquist renders them as delirious, which is, I think, a wonderful translation. But why? Because at least in the case of the speculative rationalist metaphysician, something like logic is being applied. At least it's logical. Dogmatic metaphysics may be well wrong, or at least undecidable by reason, but at least it's logically coherent. Think of someone like Spinoza here. So on the traditional reading of Kant, the typical reading of Kant, the critical philosophy slams the door closed to not only speculative metaphysics as undecidable and thus dogmatic, you just have to assert it's true, but also claims derived from mystical experience as somehow worse, as a kind of raving metaphysical delirium. And given this, it's pretty unsurprising that most Kant scholars take very little interest in mysticism generally, much less the specific role that mysticism played in Kant's life, in his spirituality, and his philosophy. But it's also unsurprising that mystics, esotericists, and cultists have felt the need to answer the problems raised by the critical philosophy. After all, they've all been told basically that it impossibilizes them and trivializes them and basically makes the things that they believe something like a mental illness. This is, to my mind, all a serious problem. First, as we'll see, Kant's critical philosophy is much, much more subtle when it comes to the question of mysticism, mystical experiences, and the data received from those exact experiences. And secondly, I think the critical philosophy has, in fact, raised some of the most crucial phenomenological, metaphysical, and psychological questions of all modernity, of all history. And anyone who just ignores them because they don't like the questions or they're hard, they do that at their own intellectual, philosophical, and spiritual peril. But to understand what's at stake in Kant's often very subtle positions on the possibility of mystical knowledge, we need to turn to one of his strangest texts, frankly, the 1766 book, The Dreams of a Spirit Seer. Now, as you probably know, scholars typically divide Kant's philosophical career into pre- and post-critical periods. roughly before and after his 1770 dissertation, where he introduced the notion that space and time were neither absolute containers a la Newton nor mere relations a la Leibniz, but mental intuitions that we read into nature. But this so-called Copernican hypothesis that extramental objects must conform to the human mind to be mental representations as such is actually only one aspect of the critical philosophy. And this is actually on display in the 1766 Dreams of a Spirit Seer. In this rather curious volume, one that manages to still embarrass Kant scholars down to this day, Kant is trying to strike a balance between several different positions. One, he wants to frankly settle his own fascination with the existence of the spiritual world with his own growing skepticism, probably inspired by David Hume. But he also wants to explore the limits of what might be actually known about spirits and the spirit world determinatively, all the while avoiding the excesses of any metaphysics run ramshot. And to do this, Kant sets out to investigate those very questions under the aegis of both philosophical and empirical analysis by turning to the life and works of that other great Emmanuel of the time, the scientist mystic Emmanuel Swedenborg. But as evidence from his private correspondence, it's pretty clear that Kant is actually of two minds about all this spirit-seeing business. On the one hand, he's rather skeptical of the whole affair, but the very specific talents of Swedenborg actually seem to Kant as striking enough to act as a true test case to see if the question holds any merit whatsoever. He's really impressed, and he thinks Swedenborg does have some kind of mystical powers. In the early, more sympathetic chapters, Kant actually holds that he's in fact inclined to believe that such spirits in fact exist, and that the human soul is actually one of those spirits. In fact, the existence of a shared moral reality among human beings may actually be evidence of such a shared invisible spiritual reality. Kant's reasoning here is that if morality were merely individual, it wouldn't exist as morality. We'd simply do whatever was best for ourselves at a given moment. But we don't do that. We often do what's best for others, or delay what's materially best for ourselves for some higher, sometimes even abstract moral goods. A strangely shared, though admittedly not terribly reliable trait among seemingly all human beings across cultures. Indeed, spirits may be able to interact like with other spirits, but this produces a kind of problem. Human cognition, it seems to Kant, is bound up, at least in substantial part, with our physical constitution and sensations. Spirits wouldn't have that kind of limitation. Thus, they might be able to influence our minds directly, but how would we know the difference between such spiritual causation, or pneumatic causation as he has it, and just delusions? Indeed, if one were to see spirits or visions, wouldn't it be more likely just to conclude that one has simply displaced the objects of the imagination outside of the mind or onto the visual field, thus falling victim to a kind of delusion, rather than making the metaphysical leap and conclude that, a great invisible world of spirits exists? That seems to be a much bigger metaphysical leap. One could easily extend this line of reasoning. Insanity is pretty common among individuals, or common enough, but how often do spirits appear to a crowd, in a lab, with a bunch of cameras rolling? You seen them kind of spirits recently? I haven't. Kant then extends this skeptical line of inquiry about dreamers of sense, that is to say spirit seers, to dreamers of reason, that is to say metaphysicians, who he thinks similarly dream up vast castles in the sky with their speculative systems. And to appreciate Kant's point here, think about all those varied Gnostic, Hermetic, Kabbalistic, Neoplatonic, or rationalist systems of metaphysics, all filled to the brim with every manner of emanation and henads and trinities and chains of beings and levels of reality and spherote and treasuries of light and syzygies and infinite monads and infinite attributes a la Spinoza. And ask yourself, is there anything in this speculation that grounds it in anything other than, trust me, bro, Is there any kind of argument, much less proof, for all these flights of metaphysical fancy? Why do there seem to be as many systems as there are systematizers? This is Kant's worry, that these systems are dreams of reason, as he puts it. Reason allowed to flail, unchecked, producing ingenious nonsense. Ultimately, Kant does come to a rather optimistic but cautious conclusion. You can't use reason to rule out the existence of spirits or the spirit world or any given system of metaphysical speculation. Thus, they might exist, and given the totality of evidence from all over the world and people's experiences, Kant concludes that experience may in fact provide existential belief in such a world of spirits for oneself. But that a theoretical proof for such a world will likely prove impossible. Thus, such a faith may be reasonable, even if it can never be proved. Now, the second part of the book is an absolute tour de force of Kant's own hypocrisy, with its scathing analysis of Swedenborg's mystical feats compared with his own Kant's own private admittance in his correspondence that he himself was actually convinced of Swedenborg's mystical abilities. Now, as others have suggested, and I agree, all of this bluster and mean-spirited bravado, frankly, on Kant's part is probably as much as him taking out his rage on Swedenborg, who didn't reply to Kant's lengthy correspondence, but also just giving himself plausible deniability given the Enlightenment rage against all things superstitious, including Swedenborg. However, the final programmatic sections of the book are actually pretty insightful. There, Kant seeks to separate what science can understand to become knowledge from what reason requires to achieve wisdom. Simply put, Kant identifies that there are simply aspects of reality which science cannot probe, and speculative metaphysics and mysticism simply may not admit of scientific proof. It might just be the case that science can't prove or disprove them because they're not susceptible to that kind of proof. Indeed, he notes that science, in its vanity, seeks to just deem unreal anything that it cannot confirm, a position that Kant thinks of as indefensible hubris, and I tend to agree with Kant here. However, he also seeks to subject philosophy itself to a critique to come to learn the limits of reason itself. What is necessary for human thought, and beyond which reason cannot rightly aspire. Thus, while the mystic might be able to take refuge in their existential surety via their own experiences, such experiences cannot be said to produce knowledge as such, not even for the person having the experiences. But to get at just that limit on pure reason for the speculative metaphysicians or the pure intellectual cognition for the mystics, we need to turn now to the Critique of Pure Reason and eventually to the one touchstone of such metaphysical experiences in practical reason or ethics. At the heart of the critical philosophy as it takes shape in the Critique of Pure Reason is the so-called Copernican hypothesis that I've already mentioned a few times now. That is, that the data given from the senses is always already conformed to two intuitions, the concepts of space and time, in a set of categories like quantity, quality, and relations, especially something like cause and effect. These are a bit like mental filters which condition any experience to be formed into thoughts or representations in our minds. We just simply can't think of anything outside of space and time for Kant. Thus, they aren't innate ideas a la Descartes, those would just be empty of content, but nor are we just passive recipients of the Gestalt manifold of sense data streaming at us constantly. He's asking, how do I pick out any object to be a representation in my mind at all? But a real question is, how did Kant come to this conclusion starting at around 1770? Well, the usual classroom answer is famously that Hume awoke him from his dogmatic slumber with his skeptical empirical analysis of especially inductive reasoning about the way the world operates. That is to say, we see objects moving about in space, we see the sun rising or billiard balls smacking into each other, and we assume that they're being affected by some deeper force like the metaphysics of something like cause and effect. But Hume points out, you can zoom in as much as you like as the billiard balls hit each other, but you'll never actually observe cause and effect itself. You'll never know inductively that the sun will always rise, and in fact it won't one day. Thank God. Kant found skepticism a bridge too far and sought to combine empiricism with rationalism. But there are at least two problems with this purely Humean thesis for the origins of the Copernican hypothesis. The first is that while Hume's skepticism may have prompted some major doubts, it certainly didn't pave the way for Kant's own conception of space, time, or the categories of the understanding, which are just simply not at all Humean. Secondly, similar concepts also appear in the Clarke-Leibniz correspondence of 1768. Those are a bit closer to Kant's own pre-1770 Wolffian Leibnizian metaphysics. But an unlikely but more than plausible locus for the origins of the Copernican hypothesis are in Swedenborg's own mystical writings. Palmquist and Johnson have made a compelling case, and some others have made this case too, that certain key elements of Kant's post-critical philosophy actually have their origins in the mystic Swedenborg. These would include things like a shared dual aspect metaphysics, which is to say Swedenborg believed in a pneumatic and a physical realm with Kant's noumenal and phenomenal worlds. Swedenborg held that space and time were only real in the physical world, with the physical world appearing solely to the senses in the form of representations. Indeed, spiritual realities had to take on a garb of space and time to appear to physical creatures, with even Swedenborg's own visions being admitted by him to being mere representations of their higher spiritual reality. Further, human beings straddle the physical and spiritual worlds and are thus bound by two sets of laws, the material world bound by physics and the spiritual world being bound by ethics into a kingdom of ends. Yes, Kantian language. Indeed, if we follow spiritual laws for any other reason other than their spiritual good, we don't accrue their spiritual benefit to us. Yes, that sounds a bit like Kant. Indeed, Kant even admits to these similarities in the Dream Seer and in some of his correspondence, but then he says, oh, those similarities are merely coincidental. They're just apparent. And to be sure, Swedenborg and Kant go in very different directions, and under the hood, these conceptions are often quite a bit different. But given Kant's very close reading of Swedenborg around the time of the development of the Copernican hypothesis, and at least his private sympathy for that mystic's own powers and his own origins, Kant's own origins in the world of Christian pietism, it seems to me that the critical philosophy, often thought to be the herald of doom for mysticism, was in fact born out of the Western esoteric tradition, at least in some substantial part. But to understand what kind of metaphysics is possible and what role mysticism might play in the production of knowledge for Kant, we must turn again to the first critique in a bit more detail. At stake is to what degree, if any, can the critical philosophy accommodate speculative metaphysics or mysticism as a grounds for knowledge of any kind. For his part, Kant does indicate that, quote, if we could intuit the things in themselves as they are, we would see ourselves in a world of spiritual natures with which our only true community had not begun with our birth and would not end with our physical death. Thus, Kant himself seems very open, enthusiastic about the idea to this pure, true spiritual reality, not only in Dream Seer, but also in the Critique of Pure Reason itself. However, such a direct intuition of things in themselves is simply impossible for the human being, and Kant seems to be speaking as if he were seeing that from a God's eye perspective. But of course, the mystic might counter, that's exactly what occurs in a mystical experience. We get that direct God's eye level of sight, the direct intuition of the things in themselves, an immediate experience of absolute reality. And of course, Kant's response here would be to point out that the notion of immediate experience is for him just a contradiction in terms vis-a-vis the human mind. Experience just is the process of mediation via the intuitions and the categories, thus making the concept of UPG, unverified personal gnosis, basically doubly redundantly wrong. However, this does leave open the possibility that spiritual beings, including God, might indirectly interact with the mind. For instance, we might experience the divine in the sound of ringing church bells, art, music, nature, etc. But again, the ground of such experiences will always remain mysterious to us. We may even have faith that we experienced a spirit or an angel or a divine nature via nature or music or something, but can we ever know that for a fact? Kant would argue flatly that we cannot. The experience of the numinous is fundamentally mysterious. But this doesn't quite close the door to mystical experiences in themselves yet. Note that Kant is only pointing to the process by which experience can become knowledge via the proper application of reason. He's developing a metaphysical foundation for scientific knowledge, specifically Newtonian knowledge. And while Kant does close the door to immediate experience as the grounds for scientific or determinate knowledge, he does allow for the possibility that immediate experience, including immediate experience of the divine in the form of the voice of God, that's his language, can and does occur in both ethics or practical reason and in the experience of aesthetics. And this is how I think Kant squares the mystical circle as much as one can do that. Immediate mystical experiences do occur. However, because of the Copernican hypothesis, they simply cannot become the grounds for theoretical knowledge. That's just not going to happen for Kant. Thus, no purely speculative metaphysical system can rightly be built upon such experiences. These pretended acts of pure intellectual intuition, as he has it, are exactly what Kant derides as delirium. Those are the metaphysical castles built into the sky. Those are just barred. But this doesn't totally close the door to the interaction of metaphysics and mysticism as such. Rather, it dooms dogmatic mysticism to save mysticism more generally. It shuts down false mysticisms to establish what we could rightly call critical mysticism. For Kant, as we've seen, empirical cognition cannot ground speculative or dogmatic metaphysics. Nothing can. And any attempt to do so is mere delirium on his account. So how might metaphysics be able to escape said delirium, but also not collapse back into mere vulgar empiricism? By the way, that vulgar empiricism, that kind of scientism which Kant associates with the vanity of science, is for Kant far more dangerous than even the wildest speculative metaphysics. Why? Because of what makes true critical mysticism possible as such. For Kant, we do have immediate access to metaphysical reality, not through pure reason, but through practical reason. That is, through morality, through ethics, and in some sense via aesthetic experiences. Now again, I'm not going to try to detail all of Kant's ethical and aesthetic theories here. That's just nope. But his ethical theory centers around that famous disciplining of our wills to perform our most fundamental duty. Act only according to that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law without contradiction. You shouldn't lie because willing everyone to lie contradicts the very concept of truth upon which the concept of lying is logically reliant. It produces a kind of contradiction. You can't will that for everyone. Now, recall back in Spirit Seer when Kant argued that there may be a spiritual reality because of our shared moral sense, rather than just some brute empirical ethics of the individual. Kant now doubles down on that intuition, now claiming that in our very pangs of conscience, as we weigh moral decisions, we are directly, immediately experiencing contact with the divine spiritual realm. When we hear our conscience tell us, you got to do your moral duty, you are hearing the voice of God. Now, this has a curious effect. While we cannot know if a given speculative metaphysical system is true, given the Copernican hypothesis, we can now have a touchstone to see if one is false. Do such mystics and prophets and metaphysicians who wheel up all these elaborate systems induce us to violate the moral law as it's expressed in the categorical imperative? If no, they might be right, and you might be able to follow them based on your experience. But if they do induce you to contradict the moral law, then we can be certain, at least in that respect, that those systems are not an expression of the divine will, whose voice, again, we experience in our conscience. Indeed, adherence to the moral law is for Kant the core of the critical mysticism as such. Practical reason is the Spartan discipline which tames idle metaphysical speculation and also grounds it in the world of practice, something which honestly aligns very well with the history of most mystical traditions. They're not just spinning yarn for the sake of it, they want you to be a good person. Finally, aesthetics, especially in the experience of the sublime, is where the understanding itself can be overpowered by the mathematical or dynamical magnitude of an experience. While Kant is curiously silent in his discussion in the third critique about the intersection of the experience of the divine and the sublime is underwritten by the concept of infinitude, or boundlessness really, which overwhelms human understanding. That's why I've been putting experience here in quotes. In these moments of the immediate sense of overwhelm, they're not experiences. Recall each experience of the sublime by definition is actually the breakdown of the normal functioning of intuition and reason, the very mechanisms by which experiences are generated. We come nearest to an immediate confrontation with infinitude, with unboundedness. Perhaps the nearest such experience we might have of the divine while in a physical body bound by the intuitions of time and space and the categorical organizations of pure reason. It's like a glitch in our understanding where you can, address a wrong memory bank and buffer overflow the whole thing, and that's the sublime for the human being. But with the moral law and the experience or the overwhelm of the sublime as a kind of mystical experience, we can now better appreciate that most famous quotation from the second critique. Two things fill the mind with ever new and increasing admiration and awe, the more often and steadily we reflect upon them: the starry heavens above me and the moral law within me. I do not seek or conjecture either of them as if they were veiled obscurities or extravagances beyond the horizon of my vision. I see them before me and connect them immediately with the consciousness of my existence. To which I would add a lesser known, but to me, my favorite anecdote about the piety of Kant. Gabriele Rebel recounts that Kant was a profoundly religious man. When he had discovered that in a bad summer, swallows throw some of their own young out of the nest in order to keep the others alive, he said, "My intelligence stood still. There was nothing to do but to fall on one's knees and worship." Immanuel Kant is the crown jewel of philosophical modernity, and his philosophy simply requires a response, especially for anyone interested in the intersection of philosophy, religion, or mysticism, or any intellectual or spiritual tradition born from any experience of gnosis or mysticism. The project of the critical philosophy, the Copernican hypothesis, the limits on speculative or dogmatic metaphysics, the narrow possibility of experiences of the spiritual and ethics and aesthetics, and the once and future project of a true critical mysticism all interpolate those on the path of gnosis and mysticism, and perhaps Western esotericism more generally. But Kant's interpolated pietism, and influenced by Swedenborg no less, also indict all those academic philosophers that would choose to pretend that modern philosophy was itself not born from the profound esoteric, intellectual, and spiritual currents which really did, at least in part, give rise to it. for me, I look forward to further development of this concept of critical mysticism, and for modern philosophy actually acknowledging, much less settling, its erstwhile esoteric conscience. The literature on Kant is just immense in a way that itself borders on the sublime. However, literature on Kant and religion, especially regards mysticism, or what we might call the esoteric Kant, is not shockingly completely niche. Stephen Palmquist is one of the central scholars leading the way forward here, and his Kant and mysticism is just a breath of fresh air and absolutely wonderful scholarship. A great text, but you're going to need a good bit of background in Kant to really appreciate it at all. He also has a great edited volume with Chris Firestone, which is again paving the way for a new approach on the question of Kant and mysticism and religion more generally. Johnson and McGee's edition of Dreams of a Spirit Seer and other writings is a fantastic edition and a very, very good place to start in this whole discussion. And of course, Wout Hancraft's Swedenborg, Oettinger, and Kant, Three Perspectives on the Secrets of Heaven, is also necessary reading here as well if you want to get into the esoteric Kant, for lack of a better term. As for reading Kant himself, good luck with that. What I will say is that the best resource that I found for working through the first critique by yourself is a really, really wonderful YouTube course on the whole book by a professor at the University of Leiden in the Netherlands, which I will definitely link to in the description below. His work is just fantastic. It took me 2 back-to-back semesters in graduate school, which those built upon undergraduate classes in modern philosophy and then specific seminars in undergraduate on Kant, before I ever felt ready to work through the Critique of Pure Reason, even in a class. So again, I wish you Godspeed and good luck. Of course, Cambridge also collects Kant's critical works on religion, which are just fascinating, but again, you need to get a lot of Kant before you dig into those. Kant's Critique of Pure Reason was the first book of philosophy that I have to admit I felt truly, truly defeated me. I literally put a hole in the drywall in my house as a teenager when I threw it across the room. Now, some 30 years later, I'm significantly less likely to chuck it across the room. More on philosophy and esotericism to come. Until then, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and thank you for watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion.